Now it is time to learn the knit stitch English style. To start, you'll need a slip knot, and then you'll need to long tail cast on 14 more stitches. This will give us 15 stitches total to practice on. If you need help with any of those techniques, just look for the links in the description box below. After you finish casting on your 15 stitches, you'll have this needle in your right hand, but we actually need to switch this needle that has all the stitches on it into our left hand and pick up the empty needle with your right hand. Before we even start to make a knit stitch, we're going to move our tail yarn so that it's out of the way. We only want to pick up the yarn that's coming from the ball. We're also going to scoot our stitches up so that they are very close to the end of the needle. Your needle will actually start to taper before it gets to the tip, and we always want our stitches on still the fattest part of the needle, not on the tapered end, or they will be too tight, but we don't want them so far back either. So if we scoot them up till right before it starts to taper, that will be perfect to make our stitches even. Now we're ready to begin making a knit stitch. So pick up your empty needle in your right hand and go ahead and adjust your left hand so you're holding closer to the tip of the needle. We have a lot more control if we hold down here towards the tip of our needle. We're going to start by knitting this first stitch here. So with your right hand needle, you're going to come from the left side and go into this stitch so that your needle crosses to the back. I'll show that again. From this side, go into the stitch so that your right needle crosses to the back. It's right through that stitch. So one more time, come into the stitch so that your needle crosses to the back. Now with English style knitting, we're going to need to free up our right hand. So with your left hand, go ahead and pinch so that you're holding on to this crisscross. That leaves your right hand to grab onto the yarn that's coming from the ball. You're going to take the yarn and wrap it around the back and then in between these two needles. So again, that right hand is free to grab your yarn, wrap around the back, and then in between these two needles. Let's see what that looks like a little more from the top. With your right hand, grab the yarn, wrap it around the back, and then in between these two needles. So now we have a back needle that is wrapped with our new stitch. Here comes the part that's a little bit tricky. We're actually going to slide that right hand needle down so that we can make a scoop. We're going to scoop back through that stitch. I'll show you that again. You're going to scoop back through that stitch. The last part of a stitch is really easy. We're actually going to slide off of our left hand needle so that our stitch transfers to the right hand needle. Okay, I know that a lot goes into making just one knit stitch, but let's do it again and I'll simplify things just a little bit. So first with the right hand needle, we're going to go into the stitch and cross to the back. Then we're going to pinch, and our right hand is free to grab the yarn and wrap around the back and in between our needles. Our right hand needle is going to scoot down and scoop that stitch back through, and then we're going to slide off to our right hand needle. We're going to keep repeating this all the way across these 15 stitches. As you go, you'll find that you need to scooch your stitches down so that they're again close to the tip but not on the tapered part of the needle. Let's talk about what happens when you get to the end of your first row. You're still going to make this last stitch exactly the same. Coming from this side, dive into the stitch and cross to the back. Pick up your yarn, wrap it around the back and in between. Scooch down and scoop that stitch and slide it off. At the end of the row, you're left with a full needle of stitches in your right hand and an empty needle in your left hand. To begin the next row, all you need to do is swap these hands. What I like to do before beginning the second row is just set that empty needle down, and let's take a look at this needle that's full of stitches. I'm going to make sure that nothing is, twisted up. Sometimes it gets a little twisted. I'm going to make sure that all my stitches are falling nice and neatly in line. I'm also going to check on this very first stitch here. This is my yarn coming from the ball. See how it's pulling down and I only have one stitch? It's pulling down to the front, and this is exactly how I want it to be. An easy mistake to make as a beginning knitter is you can have this yarn actually crossed to the back. See how I just created 2 stitches by doing that? I want to make sure that this yarn from the ball is always coming down to the front, and that little stitch on the end needs to be pushed down. It's going to look a little loose, and that's perfectly okay, because when we start the next row, it will get tightened up, so don't worry about it. So let's look at how we begin our second row of knitting. It's actually just the same as the first. Our left hand needle is full of stitches and our right hand needle is empty. If you ever set your knitting down and pick it up, make sure that the left hand needle is the one full of stitches and the right hand needle is the empty one. So we're just going to dive into this first stitch, cross to the back, pick up your yarn, wrap it around back and in between, slide down to scoop, and slide off your needle. You're going to continue this across to make your second row. So that's it. Now you know how to do the knit stitch. Just keep repeating what we've done for the second row for all of the following rows. Now we're going to do the knit stitch on circular needles. It's really similar to what we've already done with straight needles, but I'll give you a couple of tips to help you know which needles you should pick up. Again, we're going to start with a slip knot and then do the long tail cast on until we have 15 stitches. What makes circular needles a little bit trickier is that they're connected, so it can be a little bit harder to distinguish which hand we're supposed to have our needles in. So I've just finished my long tail cast on, and this needle is full of stitches. This is actually the needle that needs to come into my left hand, so I'm just going to switch it over so that this needle is in my left hand. That frees up my right hand to pick up the empty needle. And now we're all set up and ready to do the knit stitch. Before I begin, I'm going to slide my stitches until they're almost to this tapered part of the needle. I don't want them on the tapered part because that will make my stitches too small and too tight, but I want them just up to where it starts to taper. I'm also going to move my tail yarn so that it's out of the way because the only yarn I want to be knitting with is the yarn coming from the ball. Now we're ready to make a knit stitch. With my empty right hand needle, I'm going to go into this first stitch here. Coming from the left side, I'm going to slide into the stitch and let my needle cross to the back. So let's see that again. I'm going to slide into the stitch and let this needle cross to the back. Let's see what that looks like from the top. I'm going to slide into the stitch and my needle crosses to the back. You can see that I'm completely into this stitch here. Since I'm going to be knitting English style, I need to free up my right hand to grab my yarn to throw it. With circular needles, I find this a whole lot easier than with straight needles. What you're going to do is take your left hand and pinch onto that crisscross that we've made. It's really easy to hold with circular needles. Now my right hand is free to grab onto my yarn. You're going to take the yarn and wrap it around the back and in between your needles. So again, pick up that yarn with your right hand, go around the back and cross in between. Let's see what that looks like again from the top. Pick up that yarn, go around the back, and then cross in between your needles. So we've just wrapped our yarn around the back and in between the needles. Our next step is to pull that new stitch through. So we're going to slide our right hand needle down just a touch, and then we're going to use it to scoop that yarn back through our stitch. So let's see that one more time. We're going to slide down and scoop back through our stitch. The last step is to slide that stitch off the left hand needle and it moves over to our right hand needle. So that's it, you just made your first knit stitch. So let's go through those steps again. We're looking at the second stitch now. Coming from this side, we're going to go into the stitch and cross to the back. With our left hand, go ahead and pinch. With our right hand, we're going to wrap our yarn around the back and in between the needles. Slide that right hand needle down so that it can scoop back through that stitch. Slide off the left hand needle and on to the right hand needle. Keep going, making knit stitches all the way across until you get to the very last stitch. When you get to the very last stitch, we're still going to do the same motions. So coming from this side, cross to the back, wrap around, scoop, and slide off. So we've just ended our first row. We've got a needle full of stitches in our right hand and an empty needle in our left. All we need to do to get going on the second row is actually flip-flop these. So just switch the needles in your hand. Before I start the next row, I always stop to check in on my stitches. I'm going to make sure that they're all falling to the bottom and not twisted up. I also need to check on this first stitch because if I have it twisted the wrong way, I'm going to keep increasing my stitches on accident. Right now I've only got one stitch here on the needle, but if this yarn was actually pushed off to the back, you can see that I've now created 2 stitches. It's really easy as a beginner to increase our stitches accidentally. So make sure that your yarn from the ball is always hanging down to the front and that this little stitch on the end is always pushed down and out of the way. Now I'm ready to begin my second row of the knit stitch. It starts just the same as the first. My empty needle's in my right hand and my needle full of stitches is in my left. Go ahead and with that right hand needle, go into your stitch, cross to the back. With your right hand, pick up your yarn, wrap around and in between, slide down to scoop, and slide off. Continue knitting all the way across your second row. Just keep repeating these steps to make more and more rows of the knit stitch. So let's talk about what happens if you set your circular knitting needles down and you don't know which needle to start with. I'm always going to look for the yarn coming from the ball, and I'm going to slide my stitches onto the needle that's going in that direction. Then all I need to do is place the needle full of stitches into my left hand and pick up the empty needle in my right hand, and I am ready to go. Now you know how to make the knit stitch with both straight and circular needles. If this method of knitting did not feel comfortable for you, go to the videos for continental knitting. In continental knitting, you'll hold the yarn in your left hand, and this might be more comfortable for you to do. When you're ready to learn something new, go to the purl stitch videos next.